I rewatched the last one of these that I made, and I realized that I said that the combat lasted like an hour and a half. Maybe it felt like that, or maybe I was over exaggerating because I felt like the session um, maybe was a little tedious or something, but it was not at all an hour and a half. At most, maybe it was like 45 minutes, 50 minutes or something. But I just thought that was funny. So this session that we just had featured the party going through the gore pile, which was a fun one to repair because even though it's not like it's not a super interesting terrain, like it is just a pile of dead bodies and it doesn't really like change much based off of that, but there was still plenty to describe. And there was some cool mechanical stuff that I came up with. Unfortunately, a lot of that mechanical stuff didn't come into play because it sort of only would have come into play during combat, and they only had a couple of sort of low stakes combats in this last session. So, but I'll talk about some of the mechanical aspects of the gore pile really quick. One of them is that if you are knocked prone, you take an attack from the terrain because there's all of these abandoned weapons and armor that are just strewn about everywhere, and falling down is dangerous. I also had that if you were to take a critical hit, which can include that attack from the gore pile itself, keep in mind, if they take a critical hit, that instead of taking double damage, instead they have to make a constitution save to see if they catch a disease. And I came up with some funny custom diseases for the ache. Some of them were kind of had standard effects, like I think it was called like the sugar shakes or something, where it's like their mucous membranes start to crystallize, and their constitution saves they make with disadvantage or -10 or something like that. But then you had some really weird ones that I don't want to get on all of them here, but some of the weirder ones is that like you'll start to see double, and then if you're in combat and you see double, that double might become an illusion that starts to then attack you, and you're the only person who can see it or interact with it. So you might just randomly get attacked because you have a fever and you're seeing a double vision of a goblin or something like that. So I came up with a few custom diseases. Nobody took a critical hit in combat during this session, and nobody in other ways had to come up with a disease. However, that's okay because these things can always be reused in other contexts. So I'm not upset that I like came up with those ideas because I think they're still useful. The other thing about the gore pile, and this was the one that was like most impactful for them, is that I decided that you can't rest in the gore pile. It's like this huge pile of dead bodies. There are pokey things everywhere. It's an uncomfortable place to be, and even if you were to like settle down and take a nap, you wouldn't gain the effects of being rested. Like you wouldn't be able to roll your hit dice to heal or refill your hit dice if you were taking a long rest, right? And this mechanic did give my players pause, because I did explain this to them as something that their characters would be able to tell. It's like, hey, if we tried to settle down and take a rest here, it would not go very well for us. And overall, I've been trying to make them think a little more about how they utilize their rests as a resource because of time, right? There's always this ticking clock element in this particular campaign. But in this case, saying, hey, while you're in this area, you can't rest at all, really gave them pause, and they were a little bit afraid to enter the gore pile after they heard about that. So that was cool. I think that's a good mechanic, to say that in certain areas you can't take a rest. But they ended up going in, and they brought Goblin with him, and Goblin was obviously afraid to go, and they had to like hype him up. They go in and they meet the red caps. Now the red caps, I basically depicted as like I don't know how you would say, like junkies. Like they don't necessarily need to soak their hats in blood to survive. It's more like a narcotic. So they soak their hats in blood, and then they put it on their heads, and they kind of absorb it through their thin, membraney scalp, and they're just super into that, and their whole way of life is built around just hanging out at the gore pile, maybe collecting some more bodies to add to the gore pile. But because these bodies never rot or decay, they have like fresh blood all the time that they can kind of restock on. So as they're walking through the gore pile, the redcaps don't really talk to them. They kind of ignore them. Some of them are just like straight up spaced out, like I described. Like one of them's just kind of standing there, just like staring in front of them, and that's great because it is like a break from the normal like chaos of goblins who always want to like get in your face and do stuff, but it also shows that these guys are like kind of different, and they're starting to understand like why the other goblins don't really affiliate with them. And of course they had to have a combat encounter where some redcaps just randomly attacked them. So even though they're trying to reason with and get these redcaps on their side, the rank and file redcaps are not going to listen to reason, right? So they had a nice little combat there. They got to figure out like what the redcaps were about, how they worked. They died a little bit too quickly to show off one of their main mechanics that I came up with, but that's okay. It didn't need to be like a big cool combat or anything like that, just something that would happen to show off this kind of character, right? Afterwards, they encountered the leader of the redcaps, and this was one of the biggest things about this session that happened, was that I redesigned the redcap leader. So originally I had this idea that he would be kind of like this grotesque figure who was sort of spaced out similarly to the other redcaps, but he was like a magic user and therefore was like a little more intelligent and intelligible. So that's kind of what I had in mind. But then a couple of things happened. One, my players expressed interest in befriending the redcaps because they were like, since they're shunned by the rest of the goblins, maybe they'll be more receptive to talking to us, right? Which was a great line of thought, and I wanted to reward that. The other thing was I just wasn't excited about that particular design idea. I don't know why. Maybe he was too similar to Mama Scrambly, or maybe just like it just wasn't an exciting idea for me. It was essentially going to be sort of a ripoff of Dale Kingsmill. She has this video about a redcap encounter. It was going to be basically that, like the magic user that she had in that video was essentially going to be the leader of the redcaps, and I was just going to make him into like an actual character with a name and stuff. But then I thought about it more, and I was like, since they want to befriend this character, and since they have this plan, I want to reward them for having this plan. It's not going to be successful with every leader that they go try to talk to try to get the goblins on their side, but I think at least for the first one that they really like go into it thinking, here's our plan, here's our idea. I think it should be fairly easy, and especially because they had this reasoning of, oh, it will be easy because they're ostracized from the other goblins, right? I thought their reasoning was good enough that I wanted to reward that. So I was like, what if the character wasn't like hostile or just, you know, too strange or unsociable for them to just get along with? Like, what if they were just easier to work with? So that's how I changed this character entirely, because of that, and because I just wasn't excited about it. I came up with this new version of the character called Moki Redcap, named after the Fraggle, of course. And I decided she was going to be very different. She was going to be extremely different, not just from the other redcaps, but from all the goblins they've met so far. So she was going to talk normally. She was going to be, I described it to him, this is like the closest you've seen to an attractive goblin. Like, she has smooth skin. Her eyes are not like glazed over like the other redcaps. She, you know, sits up straight and stuff like that. Like, everything about her just is more reasonable, more human, right? and I was more excited about the idea because I was like, it would be kind of a fun twist if you had the Redcaps who were like totally whacked out, but then their leader was like a super chill individual who would just want to help them out, right? So they meet her and she's cool and she immediately like accepts that Boblin is the Brouhaha, but then she gets a little more suspicious. So like, oh, what do you want me to do? There's another one out there, and you want me to fight against him? And that's where she like starts to ask him about, you know, here's what I want you to do to like get me on your side or whatever. And I thought it was successful. I think my players, they reacted and responded to that, and they were like, oh, that was like, I expected him to be like a psycho, right? But there was like a bit of a lore reason behind that. So there's basically like some magic that gets passed down. So I decided that that grotesque character that I originally planned out to be the leader of the Redcaps was her father, and that the magic that A maintains the gore pile itself to keep it from rotting, and B, the magic that kind of like affects her brain in a way to make her more cognizant than the other Redcaps, was passed down by the Redcap leaders. So the Redcaps learn this magic and they pass it down through the family line, and that's who is in charge of the Redcaps. So lore-wise, I figured, what if this magic that kind of kept her mind more clear also just kind of made her just like a normal person, right? And yeah, it is like that subversion of like, oh, everybody is afraid of these Redcaps, and they should be afraid of the Redcaps, but when it actually comes to their leader, their leader's like totally reasonable and cool, right? So that was fun. She has a big, long, basically like sleeping cap, like you see in a cartoon. It's like a big, long one. And she used to have a bell, like a jingle bell on the end of it. And she said, hey, I will help you out. I'll agree to aid your cause if you can recover this bell from this blood ooze that's been wandering around. So the gore pile isn't just Redcaps. There are some other creatures that are around in it. And she says, go retrieve the bell from this ooze. Now, the cool thing about this little quest is there were alternate requirements that went into it. So it wasn't just, I want you to kill the ooze, because the ooze stat block that I was kind of adapting to this, they were not going to be able to kill it, at least not very easily. Like, it had a ton of health, and it had sort of a vampiric touch where if they were to attack you, or you attacked it with a melee weapon, that it would do necrotic damage and gain temporary HP based on the necrotic damage it does. So this thing was not easily killed, but that's not what the objective was. The objective was to recover something from it, which is cool for an ooze because they can literally just have an object just embedded inside of it, and you have to, get it out, right? So that was the actual objective, but then the side objective was, hey, we have to make Boblin, this NPC, look good doing it. So I love those kind of encounters because it's not just, you can't solve it by just saying, oh, it's my turn, I attack. I do the same thing that I do every turn. They have to sort of improvise and figure out something to do. So Moki Redcap went with them to kind of witness and see what Boblin can do. And I reminded them, it's like, hey, remember, this isn't just about doing it, it's about making Brouhaha look good doing it so that she can be convinced that he's the real deal. So it was a great encounter. It didn't take too long or anything. There was enough stakes and tension because the ooze was able to just kind of go through the bodies, and it was making, waves or mounds in the bodies as it traveled to show that this thing was taking up a lot of space. It was very menacing. And then once it got under some of the PCs, it would seep up from the bodies and immediately damage them just by them touching it. I described it like they were feeling like pins and needles on the bottom of their feet. And because of that, it kind of like made things sort of scary. But on top of that, it was also attacking Moki, and that was a fun little angle that I put on the encounter because I wanted there to be stakes that they didn't exactly know about, that she could die. But here's the thing, if she died, not only would they lose that chance to have the allegiance of the Redcaps, but also the entire gore pile would start to rapidly decay and basically collapse in on itself. And my players didn't necessarily know this, but it would have been a great like punishment for letting this NPC die if all of a sudden they had to like escape this huge just like decaying battlefield as it was like turning to mush beneath their feet. That didn't happen though. They were able to take care of her, and in fact they had Goblin sort of like reach out and pull her out of the ooze when she was caught in it. And oh, by the way, Goblin is being controlled in combat by a player. I don't control him. He is an important NPC, but I don't want him to feel like a DM NPC because first of all, I don't really want to manage a character, and second of all, everybody would have to sit around waiting for what he's going to do. And the way it is right now, they sort of talk about what he's going to do. And I sort of like ask them up front at the beginning of combat, it's like, is Goblin in this fight or not? Basically so he can get XP. And the solution that they came up with to make Goblin look good was that, saving Moki, but also the plan that they formulated was pretty clever. It was like the sorcerer was like, I'm going to use Mage Hand, but I want Goblin to make it look like he's casting the magic to like get the Jingle Bell out of the ooze. So they had to take a turn to run over to Goblin and like explain the plan to him really quick. So I decided that took an action because you got to explain this whole plan. You got to make it it's going to take at least a few seconds, right? So use your action to explain the plan to Goblin, and then after a couple of turns, the sorcerer was in position to use Mage Hand, and Goblin had to do a performance check to sort of convince Moki that he was in fact using magic to bring the Jingle Bell to himself, which I thought was a cool solution. It was good lateral thinking, and they used the resources that they had well. And then afterwards they were like, we don't need to kill this thing because that'll be like impossible. So they just left the scene and were able to get the allegiance of the Redcaps. So overall, cool session. You had a good combat, you had some good NPC interaction, you had some good problem solving and lateral thinking, and I mean, like, that's pretty much what you want out of a D&D session, I think. So that was very cool. Their next plan is to go encounter the Junkers, which are the, Goblin engineers and tinkers and stuff. And their leader is too smart to not be ready for them. So they're going to show up, and I'm thinking either it's going to be on lockdown or the leader is going to be trying to outsmart them, have a false allegiance with them, and sort of subvert it. But yeah, the leader of the engineers has already seen the real Brouhaha and knows what's up. So it is going to be a more hostile situation, and I'm super excited to play this faction because the techie goblins are, first of all, it's one of my favorite goblin archetypes, after like the really weird Jim Henson goblins. I think techie goblins might be my favorite. So I'm excited for that. I have a lot of stat blocks for that, and I think the combat is going to be really goofy and kind of up that like up the freaking like Looney Tunes sort of style that we had with the Goblin Excite bikes, and I'm looking forward to it.